Don't worry about the leather sofa, just dump the red wine on it. By the time she gets back from Chicago, we'll tell the insurance company it was a burst pipe from the upstairs bathroom. That was my sister-in-law, Brenda's voice, steady, casual, and completely unbothered, coming straight through the hidden bookshelf camera in my living room. I was sitting 700 miles away in a dimly lit hotel room in downtown Chicago, my corporate conference materials spread across the desk, watching a live high-definition feed of my own home being systematically dismantled. Brenda was holding a duplicate key I never gave her, waving a bottle of Cabernet like a conductor's baton while her friends laughed in the background. My husband's sister didn't look like a thief on camera. She looked like a woman who believed she had finally found a way to turn my life into cash. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Now, let me take you back to the spring of 2024, to a coffee shop in Boston, Massachusetts, and the first time I realized that some people don't want to join your family. They want to inherit it. Growing up, I was taught that boundaries weren't walls, they were agreements. My name is Sarah, and I am a 31-year-old senior compliance auditor for a logistics firm. My job requires me to look at structures, find the variances, and document the deviations from the standard. It's a dry way to make a living, but it trains your eyes to see patterns before they become catastrophes. When I married David 2 years ago, I knew his family carried a lot of unexpressed weight. David is a gentle soul, an architectural draftsman who assumes everyone else has the same structural integrity that he does. His parents had passed away within 6 months of each other during our engagement, leaving behind a modest estate that was split evenly between David and his older sister, Brenda. Brenda was 34, a woman who lived her life in the conditional tense. She was always about to start a business, about to close a deal, or about to settle her debts. She wore designer clothes that still had the plastic tags tucked under the armpits so she could return them on Monday. She drove a leased luxury SUV with a cracked windshield because the deductible was more than her checking account balance. To Brenda, appearance was the asset, and reality was just a temporary inconvenience. My parents, who ran a small hardware store in Maine, used to call people like Brenda all foam and no beer. They valued consistency above all else, and within 3 weeks of meeting Brenda, I realized her only consistency was her resentment toward anyone who had built a foundation without her help. The first conflict over our home started before we even moved the boxes in. David and I bought a mid-century colonial in Worcester, a fixer-upper that required 6 months of plastered dust, copper pipe replacements, and late-night floor sanding. I paid for half the down payment with savings I'd kept since my first internship at 22. David paid for his half from his share of his parents' estate. Brenda had received her share on the exact same day in a lump sum check for $140,000. By the time David and I closed on our house 9 months later, Brenda's money was gone. She told David it was invested in a boutique digital marketing agency. But when I ran a routine corporate registry search out of habit, the entity didn't exist. The funds had simply dissolved into high-end rentals, weekend trips to Miami, and a lifestyle designed to make her former classmates look poor on social media. When we invited Brenda over for our first housewarming dinner in November, she walked through the front door, ran her finger along our newly sealed quartz countertop, and looked at David. "It's cute," she said, her voice dropping into that polite register that carries more venom than a shout. "A bit small for what you spent, don't you think? Dad always said you were too conservative with your numbers, David. If you'd given that money to me to invest, we could have bought a place in the Back Bay by now." David just smiled, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch, and said, "We like the quiet here, Brenda." I didn't say anything. I went to the stove, checked the roast, and watched Brenda drop her designer handbag directly onto our handmade walnut dining table, the one David had spent 3 weekends sanding down by hand. She slid it across the surface, leaving a long, pale scratch in the fresh lacquer. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look down. "Oops," she murmured, already looking at her phone. "Sarah, do you have the Wi-Fi password? My cellular data is lagging." Between that November and this past January, Brenda's presence in our life became a masterclass in incremental encroachment. She began asking David for small favors that always turned into financial transactions. Her car needed an alternator. David paid the mechanic because Brenda promised her client check was clearing on Friday. Friday came and went, and when David gently brought it up over text, Brenda replied with a broken heart emoji and a 3-paragraph story about how her landlord was threatening her over an administrative error. David let it go. "She's my sister, Sarah," he told me one night while we were loading the dishwasher. "She's all the family I have left from that house." I stood there holding a coffee mug, looking at him, and felt the familiar tightening in my chest. "David," I said quietly, "there's a difference between supporting someone and funding their distractions. She doesn't want your help, she wants your cushion." He looked away, his jaw tight, and I knew the conversation was closed. The duplicate key incident happened in February. David had left his ring of backup keys on the kitchen counter while Brenda was visiting for a Sunday lunch. She had offered to go to the basement to fetch a bottle of wine from our storage rack, a gesture that surprised me at the time, given that Brenda rarely volunteered for physical labor unless there was a camera active. She was downstairs for nearly 10 minutes. When she came back up, she was holding a bottle of Pinot Grigio and smiling that quick, brilliant smile that stops exactly at her teeth. I didn't notice the missing key until 3 days later when I went to verify our emergency lockbox hidden behind the detached garage. The silver brass key marked front door was gone. I asked David if he had moved it. He blinked, checked his pockets, and shook his head. "Maybe it fell behind the workbench," he suggested. I didn't think it fell. I knew exactly where it was, but I didn't have proof. Not yet. Instead of changing the deadbolts immediately, I did what any auditor does when they suspect a leak. I set up a logging system. I didn't just install a standard Ring camera at the front door. I built an entire ecosystem of invisible surveillance. Because of my travel schedule for work, David had agreed to let me set up a smart home integration system for security. I put a camera inside an old, hollowed-out vintage encyclopedia on the 3rd shelf of our living room bookcase, a direct line of sight to the sofa and the entryway. I placed another hidden microphone inside a smart plug adapter near the dining room sideboard. I didn't tell David the full extent of it, not because I didn't trust him, but because I knew David's face was an open ledger. If he knew I was tracking his sister, his guilt would show through the next time she asked him for a loan. I told myself it was for protection. The corporate conference in Chicago was scheduled for the 2nd week of June. It was a mandatory 4-day symposium on international logistics compliance, the kind of event where you spend 10 hours a day in windowless ballrooms looking at slides about tariff structures. David was scheduled to be out of town on the exact same weekend for a regional architectural preservation seminar in Vermont. Our house was going to be completely dark from Thursday morning until Monday afternoon. Brenda knew this because she had called David on Tuesday under the pretense of checking on his travel plans. "Oh, that's wonderful, David," she'd said over speakerphone while I was packing my blazer upstairs. "Vermont is so beautiful this time of year. You two deserve a break from that dusty house." I left for Logan Airport at 6:00 a.m. on Thursday. By 3:00 p.m., I was checked into my hotel on Michigan Avenue, the gray skyline of Chicago visible through a sheet of afternoon rain. The first alert on my phone didn't come from the front door Ring camera. Brenda was smart enough to avoid the obvious angles. The notification came from the interior motion sensor hidden in the living room bookcase at 9:14 p.m. on Friday night. I was sitting in my hotel bed. My laptop opened to a spreadsheet on supply chain metrics when the screen of my phone lit up with a silent vibration. I tapped the alert, opened the encrypted smart home feed, and watched the living room lamp click on. Brenda was standing in the center of our rug. She wasn't alone. She had 3 other people with her, a man in a leather jacket I recognized as her current real estate boyfriend, Todd, and 2 women carrying plastic grocery bags filled with alcohol and ice. Brenda was wearing my favorite silk scarf, the one my grandmother had given me for my college graduation, looped carelessly around her waist like a belt. "See," Brenda said, her voice coming through the high-gain microphone in the smart plug with terrifying clarity. "I told you they'd be gone. David thinks he's so clever with his little security system, but he forgot the basement window doesn't have a contact sensor if you use the master override from the garage box. She held up a key, our silver brass front door key, and dropped it onto the quartz island with a heavy clink. Todd, go get the cooler from the truck. We have the whole weekend. By Monday, we'll clean up the worst of it, but the sofa needs to be a total loss. Todd leaned against our refrigerator, a beer already open in his hand. You're sure about the insurance policy, Brenda? If your brother has a high deductible, he's going to look at the paperwork. Brenda laughed, a sharp, ragged sound that made the hair on my arms stand up 700 miles away. David doesn't look at anything unless Sarah tells him to, and Sarah is stuck in a convention center until Sunday night. I saw the policy on their desk last month. It's replacement cost value for contents with no sublimits on water damage. If the upstairs pipe bursts and ruins that ridiculous custom leather furniture she bought, the payout goes directly to the household account. And David still has me on his emergency signature card from before they got married. I check the balance every month. He never removed my name. I sat perfectly still on the edge of my hotel bed, the Chicago rain hitting the glass behind me, watching my sister-in-law systematically outline a plan for insurance fraud using my home as the collateral. She wasn't just hosting a party, she was staging an eviction. I reached for my notebook, drew a single clean line down the center of the first blank page, and wrote the timestamp, 9:18 p.m. CST. Target identified. Brenda turned to one of the women, a blonde in a denim jacket whose name I didn't know. Go upstairs and turn the water on in the guest bath. Just let it pool on the tile. Don't worry about the ceiling below it, that's the whole point. We need the drywall to sag by tomorrow afternoon so Todd can bring his adjuster buddy in before the regular inspectors get a look. The blonde hesitated, a plastic cup of vodka in her hand. Brenda, isn't this a felony? Like serious fraud. It's only a felony if you get caught, Brenda said, her face tightening as she walked over to our $4,000 custom aniline leather sofa, the one I had saved for 6 months to buy from a designer in Portland. She took her glass of red wine, tilted her wrist with absolute deliberation, and poured the dark liquid directly onto the center cushion. I watched the stain spread across the porous leather, a deep, ugly circle of purple soaking into the grain. Oops, Brenda whispered to the empty room, her eyes reflecting the amber glow of our lamp. Looks like a major leak from above. My fingers were ice cold against my laptop trackpad. I didn't call David. I didn't call the Worcester Police Department. Not yet. If I called the police now, Brenda would claim she had permission to be there, that it was a family gathering gone wrong, a domestic dispute with no criminal intent. The red wine could be called an accident. The water upstairs could be called negligence. To catch an auditor's target, you don't stop the variance while it's happening. You let the record accumulate until the deviation is undeniable. I opened my recording software, set the storage path to our corporate cloud drive, and settled in to watch the rest of the night. By 11:30 p.m., the living room was a wreckage of empty bottles, cigarette ash dropped onto our hardwood floors, and the loud, distorted bass of a portable speaker Brenda had set up on our sideboard. But it was the conversation at the kitchen island that made me lean closer to the screen. Todd and Brenda were hovering over a legal pad, their heads closed together under our pendant lights. The title is the problem, Todd was saying, his pen tracing something on the paper. David has his name on the deed with Sarah as tenants by the entirety. You can't liquidate his share of the estate assets while she's alive without her signature on the disclosure forms. I don't need her signature for the secondary accounts, Brenda said, her voice dropping into a low, rapid hiss that the high-gain microphone caught perfectly over the music. The probate attorney left 3 accounts open under the family trust name from their mother's estate. David thinks they're empty, but there's still $42,000 in residual mutual funds that haven't been swept into his main checking. I have the power of attorney form from 2022. It was never revoked. If we transfer the funds to my LLC tomorrow morning before the weekend ledger closes, the transaction logs as a legacy distribution. By the time Sarah runs her quarterly audit, the money will be in the offshore account Todd set up. Todd smiled, reached out and pinched Brenda's cheek. You're a bad sister, you know that. I'm an unpaid creditor, Brenda said, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the stained sofa. David got the house, he got the career, he got the quiet little life. I got nothing but advice. I'm just taking my dividend. I leaned back against the headboard of my hotel bed, my heart rate steady, my mind dropping into that cold, absolute clarity that happens when a case is fully formed. They had just moved from trespass and vandalism into grand larceny and wire fraud. They had laid out the intent, the mechanism, and the timeline in high-definition video with dual-channel audio. I looked at the clock on my phone, 11:42 p.m. The corporate conference didn't start its next session until 8:00 a.m. Saturday morning. I had exactly 8 hours before the banks opened their digital clearinghouses for the weekend ledger. I opened my email, created a new message draft to the Worcester District Attorney's white-collar crime division, and attached the first 3 video clips. Then I opened David's contact card. It was time to give the draftsman a look at the blueprint. The ringtone on David's phone was a soft, unhurried acoustic guitar loop, the kind of sound designed to wake you up gently, without a spike in your blood pressure. I hit dial at 12:01, Chicago time. It took 4 rings before his voice came through the line, heavy with the thick, disoriented fog of someone dragged out of a deep sleep in a Vermont bed and breakfast. "Sarah," he murmured, the mattress creaking behind his words. "Is everything okay? What time is it out there?" "David, I need you to sit up," I said. My voice was level, empty of the panic he was probably expecting, but it held that specific compliance tone I used when a company's ledger didn't match its inventory. "I need you to stay quiet, and I need you to open the link I just sent to your phone. Don't look away from the screen, David. Just watch." A long silence followed. I could hear his shallow breaths over the cellular connection as he tapped his screen. 700 miles away from me, and 120 miles away from him, our living room bookcase camera was streaming Brenda's boyfriend, Todd, using a kitchen knife to slice the bottom lining of our custom armchair, checking the structural frame for what Brenda claimed was an antique silver cache our mother had hidden there before she died. "Is that?" David's breath caught. It was a small, fragile sound, like a structural beam cracking under unexpected stress. "Is that Brenda? What is she doing in our house, Sarah? Why does she have a key?" "She stole the backup key from the kitchen counter in February, David," I said, my eyes fixed on my laptop screen where the blonde woman was laughing as water began to drip steadily through the living room ceiling plaster, creating dark, heavy blisters on the white paint. "And right now, she is pouring Cabernet onto your hand-sanded walnut dining table to simulate a secondary water stain. She's staging a total loss for an insurance fraud payout. And David, she's currently tracking the mutual fund accounts from your mother's legacy estate. She has a forged power of attorney form, and she's transferring the residual $42,000 to her LLC at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." "No," David whispered. It wasn't an argument, it was a plea. It was the sound of a man watching the load-bearing wall of his childhood memories give way in real time. "She wouldn't do that. She promised me. She told me last week she was finally getting her life together. She said the marketing agency was expanding." "The marketing agency doesn't exist, David. I checked the state registry 4 months ago," I said, my voice cutting through his denial gently but directly, like a surgeon making the first necessary incision. "I didn't tell you because I knew you wanted to believe her, but right now, the variance is documented. The deviation is 100%. You can either help me secure the perimeter, or you can watch her liquidate your family's name before sunrise. What's it going to be, David?" Another pause stretched over the line, heavy and cold. I could hear the wind hitting the glass of his room in Vermont. When he spoke again, the sleep was entirely gone from his voice. The gentle draftsman was gone. What was left was the rigid precision of a man who understood that when a structure is compromised beyond repair, you don't patch it, you clear the site. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "Stay in Vermont," I ordered. "If you drive back now, you'll arrive at 3 in the morning. Todd is there and he's volatile. If they see your car, they'll scrub the evidence and run. I've already routed the live feed to a secure cloud server. I need you to call the probate attorney, Martin Falk, on his emergency line. Tell him to freeze the legacy estate trust clearing ledger immediately. Don't let her move that $42,000, David. Make her pull the trigger on a dead account. I'll call him now, David said. His voice had gone flat, arctic, a tone I had never heard from him in our 4 years together. Sarah, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, David. Be accurate. I'll call you back at 6:00 a.m. I hung up, closed his contact card, and focused back on the live feed. By 1:30 a.m., the party had shifted from careless vandalism to cold, systematic pillaging. Brenda was in our bedroom upstairs now, the hidden vanity camera catching her as she went through my jewelry box. She wasn't throwing things. She was methodically separating the gold from the silver, dropping my mother's pearls into a velvet pouch she'd taken from my closet. Todd, she shouted down the stairs, her voice sharp with adrenaline. The safe under the bed is digital. What did I tell you about David's passwords? He uses his graduation year and the old street number from Hartford. Try 1994-12. Todd's voice boomed from the lower floor, muffled but distinct over the bass of the speaker. It didn't work. It's flagged as an invalid entry. Brenda hissed a curse, dropping a pair of my diamond studs into her pouch. That bitch Sarah changed it. She controls everything. She thinks because she has a compliance degree she owns this family. Just get the crowbar from the truck, Todd. If we crack the hinge, we can say the burglars did it when the pipe burst and forced the doors open. I watched her face in high definition, the narrow, calculating lines around her mouth, the complete absence of hesitation. This wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. This was an eviction of my presence from my own home. For 2 years, she had looked at my stability as a personal insult, a metric that proved her failure. By destroying the things I had bought, by breaking the lacquer on the table David had built for us, she was trying to erase the boundary that kept her outside. The emotional breakdown didn't happen while I was watching her steal my jewelry. It happened at 2:14 a.m., when the live feed caught Brenda walking into our small nursery room, the one we had freshly painted pale blue 3 weeks ago, the room where David had installed a hand-carved rocking chair for the child we were planning to welcome next year. Brenda stood in the doorway, a half-empty bottle of beer in her hand, looking at the empty crib. She didn't pause out of sentimentality. She walked over to the wallpaper, the custom botanical print I had spent 2 weekends meticulously lining up with a level, and ran her fingernail down the seam, tearing a long, jagged strip of paper away from the drywall. They're going to put a kid in here, she muttered to herself, her face twisting into something raw and ruined. A perfect little kid for their perfect little house. David doesn't even remember what our house looked like when Dad lost his temper. He thinks everyone gets a clean slate. She threw the empty beer bottle directly into the center of the wooden crib. The glass shattered against the slats, sending a spray of sharp amber fragments across the mattress pad. Sitting in that Chicago hotel room, the cold corporate air conditioning humming in the wall, a single tear slipped down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of anger or fear. It was the quiet, devastating grief of realizing that the malice was total. Brenda didn't just want our money. She wanted our peace. She wanted to ensure that every room we walked into for the next 10 years smelled like her resentment. I pressed my palm against the glass of my laptop screen, my chest aching in the dark, and let the grief turn into concrete. At 3:00 a.m., Brenda's friends finally left, their loud goodbyes echoing down our quiet suburban street. Todd and Brenda stayed behind, sleeping on our ruined aniline leather sofa, completely unaware that the blue light from the bookcase encyclopedia was documenting every breath they took. I didn't sleep. At 5:45 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from David. Falk froze the clearing ledger. The $42,000 is secure. The account will flag any transfer attempt as unauthorized grand larceny. I'm at the Worcester police station now. I drove through the night, Sarah. I couldn't sit there. I dialed him immediately. David, are you in the parking lot? I'm inside, he said, his voice shaking slightly but holding firm. I showed the desk sergeant the footage of the water valve being turned on upstairs. They're dispatching an officer for an active domestic trespass and property destruction. But Sarah, the sergeant says because Brenda is my sister and had a key, they might treat it as a civil dispute unless we can prove forced entry or grand theft. Tell him to look at the secondary file I just uploaded, David, I said, my fingers tapping the trackpad to send the wire fraud documentation. She didn't just trespass. She initiated a digital transfer using a forged power of attorney from a deceased estate trust. That moves it out of domestic property damage and directly into a federal financial felony. Tell the sergeant the compliance auditor has already verified the variance. They're looking at it now, David said. A pause. They're calling the detective on duty, Sarah. They told me to wait in the lobby. I'm boarding the 7:00 a.m. flight out of O'Hare, David. I'll be at the house by 10. Do not go inside alone. Let the state handle the structure. I closed my laptop, packed my blazers into my suitcase with the methodical precision of someone clearing a desk, and checked my reflection in the hotel mirror. My eyes were red from lack of sleep, but my face was clear. Brenda had spent 34 years believing that family meant unlimited chances to rewrite the ledger. She was about to find out that some books don't close until the audit is absolute. I checked out of the hotel, the morning light over Michigan Avenue breaking gray and sharp through the clouds, and caught a cab to the airport. While the plane was idling on the runway in Chicago, my phone screen showed a new notification from the Worcester residential grid. Brenda was awake. She was standing in our kitchen, making coffee in my espresso machine, looking out the window at the morning sun like she owned the land. She didn't know that the local detective was currently sitting in an unmarked cruiser 3 doors down, reading a printout of her text messages from the cloud server. She didn't know that Todd's digital signature on the forged power of attorney form had already been flagged by the state banking compliance network. She thought she was just waiting for the weekend ledger to clear. Before I hit airplane mode, I opened the direct audio link to the smart plug near the counter one last time. Brenda was talking to Todd, her voice lazy, filled with the satisfaction of a thief who thinks the rain has washed away the footprints. We'll leave the water running another hour, she was saying, stirring sugar into her cup. By 9, the ceiling will start to drop. Then we call David, play the crying sister who came over to check on the house during the storm, and let the insurance adjuster handle the rest. By July, we'll be sitting in Miami, Todd. To Miami, Todd murmured, clinking his mug against hers. I toggled the switch to airplane mode, the cabin pressure changing as the jet engines roared to life, and leaned back into my seat. The curiosity gap wasn't about whether they would get caught. It was about what Brenda would do when she realized that the brother who had carried her debts for 12 years was the one who had locked the cuffs. The descent into Logan Airport was a series of sharp, jarring drops through a thick layer of New England fog. I badged through the terminal at 9:15 a.m., my phone immediately vibrating with 3 consecutive notifications from the Worcester Home Automation Network. The first was a connectivity alert, bookcase camera offline. The second, smart plug audio offline. The third was a system-wide hardware warning, power failure, main panel disconnect. Brenda hadn't found the hidden lenses. She had done something much more primitive. To simulate the burst pipe catastrophic failure, she had allowed the water in the upstairs guest bath to overflow for so long that it had finally breached the floorboards, pooled over the living room ceiling drywall, and leaked directly into the uninsulated electrical conduit box behind the sideboard. She had literally short-circuited my surveillance system by drowning my house in her narrative. I caught a rideshare outside the terminal, telling the driver to take Interstate 90 west toward Worcester. My laptop was balanced on my knees, running a remote diagnostics script on our home's offline hub. The auxiliary battery backup was still pinging a low-frequency signal from the garage node, the one line she hadn't cut. At 9:42 a.m., my phone rang. David. Sarah, the detective is moving in. His voice was tight, low, transmitted through his car's Bluetooth system. I could hear the rhythmic click of his turn signal. They saw Todd leave the house 10 minutes ago to go to the hardware store, probably buying drywall patch or a shop vac to make it look like they tried to mitigate the damage. The Worcester police cruiser just pulled into our driveway. They're executing the active trespass sweep right now. Where are you? I'm passing Framingham on the Mass Pike, David, I said, squinting through the windshield at the rain-slicked highway. I'm 20 minutes out. Did Martin Falk send the verified ledger statements to the detective? Yes, David's jaw sounded locked over the words. Falk spent the morning pull-dating the bank logs. Brenda didn't just try to transfer the $42,000 once. She attempted it 3 separate times between 6:00 a.m. and 8:00 a.m. each time using her old digital key attached to the revoked legacy trust. The state compliance system automatically flagged each attempt as a fraudulent transaction from an authenticated IP address. The detective has the geolocation trace. It pins her phone directly inside our kitchen. And the power of attorney. Falk verified it, David said, his voice dropping into a hollow, ruined register. The signature on her document wasn't our mother's handwriting from 2022. She had pulled a digital scan of Mom's signature from an old car title transfer from 2018 and pasted it onto a generic power of attorney form she bought online. Falk called it an amateur forgery, Sarah. He said it wouldn't have passed a standard compliance check at a branch office, but because she tried to clear it through an automated clearinghouse over the weekend, she was betting the digital ledger would process it before a human looked at it. She bet wrong, I said. I'll see you at the perimeter, David. Keep your car down the street. When my rideshare pulled onto our suburban avenue at 10:14 a.m., the scene looked like an unedited frame from a local news broadcast. A Worcester police cruiser was parked at an angle across our front lawn, its blue lights cutting through the gray morning mist, reflecting off the wet grass. David's sedan was idling 3 houses down, his hazard lights blinking in a slow, orange cadence. Todd's luxury SUV was parked directly behind the cruiser, its trunk open, a stack of plastic storage bins sitting on the wet gravel of our driveway. I paid the driver, grabbed my briefcase, and walked toward David's car. He stepped out before I reached the door, his flannel jacket damp from the rain, his face pale, and set in lines that made him look 10 years older than 31. He didn't look at me with his usual gentle smile. He looked at me with the focused, rigid attention of a draftsman who had just discovered his foundational calculation was off by a factor of 10. The detective is inside with her now, David whispered, his hand finding my elbow, cold through my coat sleeve. Todd came back while they were clearing the living room. They cuffed him in the driveway, Sarah. He had a receipt for 3 commercial air-drying fans and a falsified plumbing invoice in his pocket. He's sitting in the back of the cruiser right now. I looked toward the cruiser. Todd's face was visible through the reinforced rear window, his jaw working as he shouted something at the empty front seat, his leather jacket pulled tight around his shoulders. Let's go inside, I said. Sarah, the water. David hesitated, his eyes dropping to his shoes. The detective said the ceiling over the dining table gave way 5 minutes ago. The plaster. It cracked down the center line. The plaster can be replaced, David, I said, my fingers clenching the handle of my briefcase. The variance needs to be cleared. We walked up the driveway together, our shoes crunching on the gravel. As we reached the front porch, the silver brass key Brenda had stolen was still sitting in the lock of our deadbolt. She hadn't even bothered to remove it after opening the door for her morning coffee. The front hallway smelled instantly of stale beer, damp plaster, and that cloying, synthetic vanilla oat milk perfume Brenda's friends had left behind. We stepped into the living room, and the structural damage was immediate. The center of our white ceiling was gone. In its place was a gaping, jagged rectangle of exposed gray lath and dripping wet insulation. A steady, muddy stream of water was still pattering onto our handmade walnut dining table, the dark fluid pooling over the lacquer, running down the legs onto our wool rug. Our $4,000 aniline leather sofa was completely saturated. Its pale beige cushions turned a deep, bruised shade of brown from the red wine Brenda had poured with such deliberate malice. Brenda was standing near the kitchen island, her hands cuffed behind her back, her designer trench coat draped over a stool. Detective Vance, a stocky man in a gray suit with a gold shield pinned to his belt, was holding her phone in a plastic evidence bag, writing something in a small pocket notebook. David, Brenda barked the moment she saw him walk through the door. Her voice didn't hold fear. It held that familiar, high-pitched outrage of a woman who believed that rules were just suggestions meant for other people. Tell this man to take these off me right now. I came over because Mrs. Harris called, and said she thought she smelled gas near the basement line. I used the emergency key to check on your property because you two were out of town. The bathroom pipe burst while I was upstairs. It was an accident, David. David didn't move. He stood in the center of the wet rug, the water from the ceiling dripping 3 inches from his sleeve, and looked at his sister. Truly looked at her. Mrs. Harris didn't call you, Brenda, David said, his voice completely clear of the hesitation that had defined his relationship with her for 12 years. Mrs. Harris has been in Cape Cod since Wednesday. I called her husband 40 minutes ago from the station. Brenda's eyes flickered, a quick, desperate microadjustment behind her long, mascaraed lashes before her mouth tightened into a hard, defensive sneer. Then it was the neighbor on the other side. What does it matter? I was trying to save your house, David. And this is how you treat me. You bring the police into a family matter. You let this compliance secretary tell you how to handle your own blood. She spit the word secretary toward me, her face flush with a dark, mottled purple. My name is Dr. Sarah Myers, Brenda, I said, stepping past the dripping ceiling to stand beside Detective Vance. I opened my briefcase, pulled out a printed 3-inch binder, and set it on the dry edge of the quartz island. And I don't run secretary notes. I run financial fraud audits. This binder contains the verified IP logs from 3 separate wire transfer attempts made from your home router between 6:12 a.m. and 7:45 a.m. today. It includes the certified title deed from the state registry proving you have 0 equity in this property. And it contains the forensic handwriting analysis of the signature you forged on your mother's legacy trust power of attorney. Brenda laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cracked down the center. That's a civil document. It's from Mom's estate. David never closed the trust, so it's half mine anyway. You can't arrest someone for transferring money that belongs to their own family. The family trust was closed in November of 2023, Ms. Lester, Detective Vance said, clicking his pen closed and pocketing his notebook. He looked at her with the dry, exhausted indifference of a suburban detective who had seen 50 versions of the same inheritance dispute. Your brother is the sole remaining executor. The account you tried to access this morning was a residual clearing account under his personal social security number. That makes it bank fraud, larceny over $2,500, and identity theft. And your boyfriend Todd just told the sergeant outside that the falsified plumbing invoice was your idea to clear the insurance deductible. Todd said what? Brenda's voice lost its pitch. The calculation finally left her eyes, replaced by that wide, blank stare of a person who has run out of rooms to hide in. She looked back at David, her lips parting as she tried to find the old script, the one where she cried about her debts and reminded him of their mother's deathbed. David, listen to me. Todd's lying. He's trying to pin it on me because his real estate license is already under review. David, you know how hard it's been for me since the store closed. I just needed enough to clear the lease. I was going to pay you back the $42,000 next month, I swear to God. You threw a beer bottle into our child's crib, Brenda, David cut her off. He said the words softly, almost conversationally, but they stopped her speech instantly, like a hand clapped over her mouth. Brenda blinked, her face draining of color until she looked like the old paper flyers she used to leave on our counter. What? I watched you on the hidden camera, David said, pointing toward the 3rd shelf of the bookcase where the hollowed-out encyclopedia sat between 2 design journals. The blue indicator light was dark now from the power failure, but the lens was still visible if you knew where to look. I watched you tear the wallpaper off the wall. I watched you pour wine on the table I sanded for 3 weeks. And I heard you tell Todd that you were going to take your dividend because I got the career and you got nothing but advice. David stepped closer to her, his wet flannel jacket heavy against his chest. You weren't an unpaid creditor, Brenda. You were just a thief who couldn't handle that the door was closed. Detective, take her out of my kitchen. Brenda didn't yell as Vance led her down the hallway. She didn't drop her head or cry real tears. She moved with that stiff, performative dignity she used when a store manager refused her return on a Monday morning, her heels clicking once on the wet linoleum before she stepped out onto the porch into the rain. The screen door closed with a soft, definitive click behind her. The kitchen went perfectly quiet except for the steady, muddy patter of the ceiling leak hitting our dining table. David stood there for a long moment, his back to me, looking at the long, pale scratch Brenda's handbag had left in the walnut wood 3 months ago, the scratch we had never bothered to polish out because we thought we had time. "We have to rebuild the entire upper subfloor," he said quietly, his hand tracing the edge of the quartz island where the stolen key had sat. "I know," I said, walking over to stand behind him, my arms wrapping around his waist, my forehead pressed against his damp shoulder. "But the ledger is balanced, David. The deviation is 0. He turned around in my arms, his face wet from either the ceiling insulation or something else he didn't try to explain, and held me against his chest while the rain outside turned into a steady afternoon downpour. We had lost our furniture, our ceiling, and our nursery wallpaper. But as I listened to the quiet rhythm of his heart in the ruined room, I knew we had kept the one thing Brenda couldn't measure in a bank ledger. We had kept the ground. The aftermath of an internal structural failure is always louder than the collapse itself. By 1:00 p.m. on Monday afternoon, our front driveway looked less like a home and more like a construction salvage site. The insurance adjuster sent by our carrier, a tall man named Marcus Vance who carried a digital measuring wheel and a clipboard, spent 2 hours moving through the house with the same dry, unblinking focus that I used during a corporate compliance review. David stood beside him on the damp lath boards of the upper floor, pointing out the exact line where Brenda had let the water pool over the joists. The structural analysis was absolute. The subfloor had absorbed nearly 80 gallons of water over 14 hours, compromising the load-bearing integrity of the main living room header directly underneath the guest bath. "It's a total loss for the drywall, the insulation, and the entire primary living room suite," Marcus said, his pen scratching against his carbon copy ledger pad with a sound that felt strangely like a reckoning. He looked down at the stained, buckled cushions of our Portland designer leather sofa. "Your policy covers replacement cost value for the structural elements, Mr. Myers, but because the damage was caused by an active criminal act under investigation, the carrier will pay the contractor directly from the emergency escrow pool. Your sister won't see a single cent of this ledger." "I don't want her to see anything," David said. His voice was steady, holding that quiet, definitive architecture he had found on the phone from Vermont. "I just want the site cleared." The legal machinery moved in the background with the same cold follow-through. By Tuesday morning, Detective Vance had filed the formalized complaint package with the Worcester County District Attorney's White-Collar Crime Division. Because Brenda and Todd had used an automated clearinghouse network to execute the fraudulent digital transfers across state lines, attempting to route the legacy trust funds into a shell company registered in Delaware. The state authorities had automatically loops-referred the case to the Regional Financial Crimes Task Force. It wasn't a domestic dispute anymore. It wasn't a family squabble over a dead mother's jewelry box. The ledger sheets I had compiled in that Chicago hotel room had elevated the case into degree grand larceny, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Todd, facing an immediate revocation of his commercial real estate license and a potential 5-year structural stretch in a state facility, had completely broken under interrogation by Tuesday afternoon. He had turned over 2 years of text messages from Brenda, detailing 3 other attempts to liquidate David's residual estate assets before we even bought the Worcester house. Brenda's phone calls from the county holding facility started on Wednesday night. I sat at our kitchen island, the temporary plywood patch overhead blocking the gray sky, watching the jail's automated routing number light up my phone's screen. I didn't answer. I let it vibrate against the quartz counter until the connection timed out, the silent blue notification logging her name over and over like a persistent variance in a closing ledger. She tried David's line next. He was sitting across from me, a blueprint for the living room reconstruction spread between our coffee mugs, his fingers tracing the new placement lines for the reinforcement beams. He looked down at the vibrating screen, his thumb hovering over the glass for 3 seconds before he swiped left, toggled the block lock, and set the phone face down on the layout. "She's going to ask for bail money, Sarah," he said, his eyes fixed on the blueprint's cross-section. She's going to say that if she misses her lease payment on the SUV this Friday, she loses her corporate placement. She lost the placement the second she signed your mother's name to a blank power of attorney, David, I said quietly, reaching across the paper to cover his hand with mine. His skin was warm, the tension around his knuckles finally softening into something predictable. Apologies expire. Boundaries don't. That's the difference between sentiment and structure. He looked up at me, a faint, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes for the first time since I had boarded the flight from Chicago. "Let's build the nursery wall double thick this time," he said, his thumb brushing my palm. "Soundproofed for the quiet." The final confirmation from Martin Falk came on Friday afternoon. The probate attorney had successfully finalized the administrative sweep of the legacy estate accounts, moving the $42,000 into a restricted capital preservation fund under our joint household ledger. The document was signed, notarized, and sealed with the state registry's emblem, a clean, definitive line that closed the book on the legacy trust forever. Brenda and Todd's formal arraignment was scheduled for the following month, but the social fallout inside the family network had already settled into a permanent, icy silence. Brenda's marketing contacts, her country club associates, and the former classmates she had spent years trying to impress on social media had quietly deleted her cards from their registries the moment the local Worcester police blotter published the active larceny filings. Nobody organized a defense fund. Nobody came to the county holding facility with a bond check. The currency she had spent 34 years stockpiling, the illusions, the borrowed luxury, the high-energy performances, had simply dissolved into the ink of a criminal docket sheet. She hadn't just run out of money, she had run out of audience. 6 months later, the reconstruction was fully complete. It was a Sunday morning in December, the first real snow of the winter falling outside our living room windows in a quiet, white cadence that made the Worcester Avenue look like a clean ledger. The new mid-century header beam was exposed, stained a deep, dark espresso brown that anchored the entire double-height ceiling. Our new aniline leather sofa, identical to the one Brenda had ruined but treated with a heavy structural protective glaze, sat directly in front of the brick fireplace. The nursery room upstairs was finished, too. The custom botanical wallpaper had been replaced by a hand-painted mural David had spent 4 weekends designing, a soft, geometric forest grid that lined up perfectly with the room's window frames. A new wooden crib, hand-built from white oak planks he'd sourced from a mill in Maine, sat in the center of the clean room, free of glass, free of dust, waiting for the child whose arrival was now 4 months away. I sat at our walnut dining table, the same table David had built, the one we had meticulously planed down by 1/8 of an inch to completely remove the deep purple Cabernet stains Brenda had left behind. The surface was smooth now, smelling faintly of citrus oil and fresh beeswax, reflecting the low winter light like glass. David came out of the kitchen holding 2 mugs of coffee, the steam curling into the warm air of the room. He didn't look back at the hallway. He didn't check his phone for text alerts. He sat down across from me, pushed 1 mug into my hands, and looked at the snow hitting the window pane. "The house feels solid today, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping into that relaxed, grounded register that had returned to him brick by brick over the winter. "The structure is within tolerances, David," I said, a small, authentic smile breaking across my face as I took a slow sip of the coffee. "The variance is exactly 0. We had walked through a domestic trespass, a staged insurance fraud, a forged inheritance larceny, and the total destruction of the house we had spent a year building with our own hands. But as I looked across the hand-sanded wood at the man who had helped me lock the perimeter, I knew the audit was finally, beautifully complete. The hidden cameras were still active in the bookshelf, not out of fear anymore, but out of a compliance auditor's respect for the permanent record. The books were closed. The columns matched, and for the first time in 2 years, the front door key belonged entirely to the people who lived inside the frame.